One of Ninjago's core underlying themes is always going to be the concept of destiny, whether that is succumbing to it or if it's overcoming it. It has two different directions, but for the most part, Ninjago's events have been fairly set in stone. But the begging question has always been, if one small detail has changed, what would happen to the show after that point? And that is what I've been trying to do. I have done one about Garmadon and I have done one about Nia, and today we're going to be doing one about Lloyd. Being, what if Lloyd never actually released the Serpentine? It's one of the most interesting questions I have done so far because it is one of the core things that causes a lot of Ninjago to actually happen. So let me not waste any more of your time and let's look at the show if the Serpentine were never released from their tombs. Now in this altered timeline, the event that has changed is the moment where the ninja first encounter Lloyd. When Lloyd threatens to release the Serpentine, instead of essentially laughing at him, mocking him in Jimonokai Village, they actually understand that it's a threat and Lloyd seemingly was serious in that moment. So instead of just, like I said, mocking him, they're actually going to take him back to Wu like how they did later on, because they understood that of course Wu was his uncle, so they thought bringing him back to Wu was the best course of mind. And by that definition, like how they do in the later episodes, we actually do get to see Wu talk Lloyd through the mistake that he was going to make, the whole thing of never trusting a stake and the story behind it, and Lloyd ends up converting to the ninja team a lot earlier on than in the actual show. So the Serpentine never released from their tombs. And because they never got released, more specifically, Pythor never got released. So Pythor would essentially have just rotted away in the Anacondrae tomb, which means also then the plan for the Great Devourer to be released would also have never have happened. So this would essentially just take away all of season 1. I do think the ninja during this time would have still have hit their true potential for different reasons, and I do think it still would have been the case. I also think they still would have realized that Lloyd was the Green Ninja, because all that had to happen was he needed to be near the weapons. So again, that would have happened eventually, and I do reckon within the same time span. The other aspect, I guess, is that Garmadon wouldn't have been called into the story by Wu specifically, but Garmadon was still clearly motioning to get out of the realm of madness at that time. So I do think Garmadon would have still have been released, it just would have been under very different circumstances. He also wouldn't have just been handed the weapons by the ninja. This is where the timeline could take one of two different motions. You could either look at a timeline where Garmadon forcefully takes the weapons from the ninja, or the ninjas continue to be the protectors of the weapons. In my timeline, they're gonna actually keep the weapons. And that would essentially round out the whole era of the first season. This also means if we do go to season 2, it means the first half of the season wouldn't happen in my timeline specifically because Garmadon doesn't have the golden weapons. Say in a scenario where he does forcefully take the weapons, I do think personally the Serpentine's role in the second season would have actually been filled by the Skulkin. I think Garmadon would have used the whole allure of having the golden weapons to actually convince them to work for him again. In similar vein to the pilot where they were trying to get Garmadon the weapons, instead in this instance Garmadon goes back to them with the weapons. So depending on which one you look at, he would either use the Skulkin for the first half of the second season, or in my timeline I'm talking about, it just simply never happened. But anyway, that does then skip over to Garmadon re-establishing the whole part of the Dark Island. Remember, he learned that on his own accord, he only ever mentioned it after the golden weapons though. But in this timeline, he does still have the thought of the Dark Island, he just goes off and finds it on his own. And he is still successful at this, it's just the whole thing of the Stone Army would have played out just a little bit differently. When Garmadon does go to the Dark Island, he would still encounter the Overlord, he would still activate the Celestial Clock and get the Helmet of Darkness. Now remember, the only reason that the Stone Army was active before Garmadon had the helmet is because of the Devourer's venom. But in this scenario, when Garmadon put on the Helmet of Darkness, the Stone Army would have still have activated anyways. The venom from the Devourer only necessarily kick-started them. Remember, before Garmadon actually put on the helmet, they were basically just mindlessly destroying everything in their path. The Giant Stone Warrior was doing it, and they were doing it in Ninjago City. They only had some sort of a plan, and they only found themselves actually doing something productive once Garmadon put on the helmet. So it shows that they could have just been jump-started by the venom, and the venom didn't actually have anything to do with turning the Stone Army on. But the whole thing of the Dark Island and the whole thing with the Stone Warriors would have played out still relatively the same. Remember, Lloyd probably still would have had to have gone to the Temple of Light to be able to have gotten the golden powers. But in this scenario, I guess the ninja would have still have gotten the elemental blades, but they still would have had the golden weapons at the exact same time. So they would have just had two different versions of the same elemental weapon. Remember, both can exist at the same time, because in the actual timeline, the golden weapons are just on a comet in space. So they can have both, and they probably would have had both just to take on the Stone Army and activate Lloyd's power. But all in all, it would have played out the exact same, being the fact that Lloyd would have eventually purged the Overlord and Garmadon would have become good. The last thing in this section though is that even though everything plays out the same, the main difference is that Lloyd would have had to have done it all young. The thing is that of course because Garmadon never has the mega weapon in this version of events, you will have to realize that Lloyd hasn't got reason to actually age up. So even though everything does play out the same, Lloyd is still actually in his younger variants. So for the whole duration of this entire timeline, Lloyd just simply would have been younger. He would have eventually become his older self, yes, and when that happens we don't particularly know because we don't have an accurate telling on the ages of the ninja, but at some point Lloyd would have just grown up into the Lloyd that we all know. But in this timeline, simply he's just a few years behind on his age, but he is doing everything still the exact same. Season 3 would have been a little more interesting because there's a couple of different factors that would have changed things more specifically. The ninja would never have learnt of the Golden Master Prophecy, but that doesn't really have much of an impact on the story. It's just they never would have looked to the Serpentine for answers when it came to the Overlord's plan. But that doesn't affect the Overlord's plan in general. So, in the end, the ninja would have still gotten to the same answer just without the Serpentine. The main answer actually comes from the end. In this timeline, remember, the ninja still have the plan to shrink the Overlord down, and the main reason why that doesn't work in the end is because of Pythor. So, the Overlord in this timeline actually does get shrunken down and gets completely overpowered by the ninja, which means Zane never actually has to sacrifice himself in this version of events. And this is literally just where the snowball effect happens from here. Because Zane never sacrificed himself at the end of Season 3, this causes a whole lot more trembling when it comes to the rest of the timeline. Because Zane will just simply remain in his more humanoid looking state. Which means Season 4 never really happens because the ninja have no intention on going to the tournament because there is no Zane. We also never get the Garmadon sacrifice at the end of Season 4, so that means Garmadon never dies in this timeline, which means Moro is never actually released, which means no Season 5, which means the Preeminent never comes out and gets destroyed, which means no Klaus getting out, which means no Season 6 either. That one small detail of Pythor not being there literally takes out multiple seasons to come. But like I said, all those seasons do not occur because the thing from the last season doesn't occur because of no Pythor. It's really weird that that one little detail makes so much of a difference. And we're not even mentioning every little difference that is actually there. I mean, this is more important later on, but this also means that Cole never actually becomes a ghost in this timeline either. So we are officially looking at a timeline where multiple seasons just never took place. Like I said, no Season 5, 6, 4, or now more importantly, Day of the Departed. Because Cole is not a ghost, he has no urge to actually go to Yang's temple, which means the villains never get released, which means the whole point of Day of the Departed just simply will not happen. Yang does ultimately try to open the Rift of Return, and you can maybe even make the argument that he still gets to do that, but the ninja have no involvement in that plot, and it doesn't necessarily make any sort of difference when it comes down to it. And also, remember, they're technically now even more powerful in this version of events, even if it did, because Garmadon is still around. Season 7 would have still have at least tried to begin because Acronix would still come out of the rift anyways. So when he touched down into the monastery, which wasn't destroyed by the way because the Hypnobride never go to the monastery, you will find that he was greeted by Wu, Garmadon and all of the ninja. Remember, at this point everyone would have still been in the monastery because there would never have been a reason for it to have been destroyed in the first place. So they easily overpower Acronix in this situation and they take the Time Blade off of him. This also would probably lead them to the realization that Crux is the other Time Twin, and that would maybe even lead them to the discovery of Ray and Maya, but that kind of comes down to whether or not defeating Acronix immediately would lead to the reveal of Crux. Crux probably in that situation would just never have revealed his true colors in any way, shape or form because he would have been at an immediate disadvantage. But the fact is that even though Season 7 would have attempted to have happened, it just never would have been able to because Crux probably would have been overpowered along with Acronix. So that's the classic era. Let's actually now get to the Oni trilogy, or more specifically the lack thereof. Remember, no Devourer is in this timeline, which means no Harumi, which means no Season 8, which also means no Season 9. So half, or 2/3, sorry, of the Oni trilogy is officially gone. That does lead then to March of the Oni. The Oni probably still would have invaded, but again, it probably would have been a situation where it would have been relatively easy to get rid of them. The worst case scenario is that the Oni invasion would have just played out exactly as it did in the show. You would have just had simply put the exact same course of events, apart from the fact that Garmadon would have been good and Mustake wouldn't have been dead. She probably would have just informed the ninja about the whole half Oni thing and everything with the first Spinjitzu Master, like how she did in Season 8. So the Oni probably wouldn't have even have been any sort of issue to begin with. So it's not exactly like that season would have changed much, it just would have been a different version of Garmadon and just a more alive version of Mustake. The 11-minute era for the most part probably would have just been the exact same as well. I can't really think of anything that really would have changed depending on the Serpentine's presence. I mean, Season 11 doesn't really have anything to do with anything. The ninja probably still would have gone out and accidentally released a Sphera. Season 12 would have still happened because Unagami still would have been developed, and the mechanic was probably still around anyways. Remember, in this scenario, he never even ended up in prison. So the mechanic probably still had something to do with it, even though he probably still had Chen to deal with anyways. But Season 13 also probably would have still happened the same, along with the island. Seabound is a bit more of a curious case because remember, the whole reason that Wojira was able to be released was dependent on a conversation between Nia and Maya. Remember, the conversation that Nia has with Maya is the reason Kalmar discovers the location of the Storm Amulet. So it's actually a case of, was the ninja actually able to recover Rei and Maya in this version of events of Season 7? If it does, then Season 14 actually basically plays out the same. If they don't find Rei and Maya, it basically just never happens. But I guess that does mean in the scenario then that Nia would have ended up being still merged with the sea and she still would have taken on Wojira, which means in this scenario we would have still have actually seen that actually happen, and that would have been the saddest moment of Ninjago, because until this point most of the major deaths just didn't happen. This would lead to Crystallize just being weird anyways, because they probably would have still have had to use a Sphera to release Nia's powers, but at the same time, Crystallize just exists in this really weird world, because remember, the Overlord was defeated in a different way, so it's dependent on how he would have been able to return in this different scenario, and remember also there's no Harumi, so the Overlord would have needed essentially a different person to be able to get through the plans that he had, but at the same time, that's relatively easy, because it could have just been anyone else that could have just bought all that Venge Stone. So Crystallize probably would have played out with a different cast of villains, but at the same time, it would have still been a lot more inconvenient. But still, for the most part, it probably would have played out the same way. We probably still would have had to have had Garmadon and Lloyd embrace their Oni side, and we probably would have still had the same outcome regardless. And last but certainly not least, then you have the merge, and as of Season 3 Part 1, I don't really have any reason to believe that the merge would have played out in any different way. Wu would have still been missing, Garmadon is still missing anyways, it doesn't really matter if he's good or evil in this scenario, and for the most part, anything that could have had an effect just simply wouldn't really have one, because we haven't even seen the Serpentine in Season 1, 2, or 3 of Dragon's Rising. So I would actually be inclined to say that Dragon's Rising basically plays out the exact same way. So that's actually the whole timeline. It does show how one event can actually change the course of a lot of things, and of course the first event that we really see within the show, which like I said is Lloyd releasing the Serpentine, truly does have that kind of knock-on effect, because half the seasons just simply don't even play out in this scenario, which is really weird to think about, but at the same time it shows why fate and destiny is always an important concept when it comes to this show. But like I said, that is my timeline. That is how I think the show would play out if the ninja just never really took Lloyd as non-serious as they did in the first episode of the show, and they prevented him from opening those tombs, and how things would have played out from there onwards. But what do you think of this timeline? Is there anything you would change about it? Is there anything you think I got wrong? Is there anything that you would rather have seen in this timeline that I have described? And above all else, of course, I would love to know what your what-if scenario is. I mean, you guys have given me a lot of them, and they're all absolutely fantastic, and I hope that I can get to them all one day. It's just I'm going to have to knock them all off, one what-if at a time. But that is about it for today, you guys, and thank you very much for watching. Take care. Okay, bye!